But say you fall off and break your leg, that you're not going to the hospital down there. And if your leg heals wrong or something happens where you're permanently crippled, that there's nobody there to take care of you. If you're lucky, you might have a child or something that can go out and make money.
You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Welcome to The Ride, a bi-weekly podcast brought to you by Horse and Rider Magazine, co-hosted by Nicole Cherico and Devin Conley. In each episode, we chat with some of the industry's top trainers, clinicians, horsekeeping experts, and professionals to share inspiring stories, training philosophies, and the importance of living your best Western horse life.
On this episode of the Ride podcast, Nicole and Devin sit down to talk with J.B. Zielke. He's a world-traveling cowboy that has been to 6 different continents working for farms and ranches. He's been immersed in a variety of horse cultures worldwide, and he recently released a book of his wild adventures called The Lost Cowboy. We chat with J.B. about everything he experienced as he traveled the world and the incredible horsemen he encountered along the way.
This week's episode of The Ride is brought to you by the Seen Through Horses campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Ride. I'm Nicole. I'm here with my co-host, Devin, and today we are with Jake Zielke, who is a world-traveling cowboy that's been to 6 continents working for different ranches. You've been a part of different horse cultures worldwide, and you also are releasing a book on your adventures. Thank you so much for joining us, Jake. I know you are a very busy guy. In fact, we weren't sure which continent you were on when we reached out to you. But for those who might not be familiar with you or follow you on social media, can you just kind of fill our listeners in on your horse background and what kind of attracted to you to this Western way of life?
Yeah. So I grew up in northern Colorado, and my family didn't really have anything to do with agriculture or horses or anything. So at a fairly young age, my mom had a friend that invited me out to come to her place. She had a ton of horses, and she wanted me and my brothers to come out and just get on and try it. I was probably 7 years old. So got on, and I was just immediately hooked, and I used to ride my bike every day, go work for free, make $5 here and there as a little kid. And horses pretty quickly to me progressed into like cattle and ranching by the time I was 10 or 12. And then I got into rodeo, rode bulls for a while, went to college, went to the University of Wyoming on a scholarship to ride bulls on the rodeo team. But the whole time, really all the jobs I've ever had have been kind of based around horses and livestock both. And that's really all I've ever done. It was something I've been passionate about since I was pretty young.
And I feel like we talked to a lot of people that weren't born into the industry, but found their way there pretty quickly. And I always think that that's such a cool story because it just proves that like you don't have to be born into this industry in any part of it to make it your livelihood or to make it your career. If you have the passion, if you have the drive, that's what matters. So that was a good little like intro into your foray into agriculture and horses and everything. Where does the idea come from to cowboy on 6 continents? Like, did you sit down someday with a globe and be like, these are the places I'm going to go to? Or walk me through this. Was this something you always wanted to do? Did it just come out of the blue?
So it was not, it wasn't like a grand plan to go do that. When I was in college, towards the end of college, I kind of hung up my bull rope, and I'd had enough injuries, and I was not a very good bull rider. So I was just getting myself hurt more than anything. So I quit doing that, and it left kind of a void in my life, and I needed some excitement, some adventure. So there was a girl that was doing study abroad at the University of Wyoming, and she was from Australia, and I asked her if she could get me work in Australia. And she was hesitant at first, but she ended up giving me the contact info for a guy over there. It was her brother. And so I contacted him and set up he said he would hire me if I would show up at the right time and right place, and really gave me very little info. And so I just packed up my stuff, and I had one semester of college left at this point. So it was during the kind of summer break, that 3-4 month period. And I went to Australia, um, caught wild feral bulls over there. We were horseback half the time, on dirt bikes the other half the time. And when I got back from there, finished school, at that point in time, I had no dreams of doing any more traveling. I thought that was kind of, I graduated college and I thought, all right, time to go get a big boy job and be a part of society. And I did that for about a year. I managed a fairly large outfit in South Central Wyoming. And when I ended up getting fired from that job after a while, it was pretty tough. And I was thinking, well, I should probably just go back to what I enjoyed doing and traveling. So then it really took off, because I had tried the being a normal member of society, and that was kind of boring and not really my cup of tea. So I went back to traveling, and it took off. I think that that next summer, somebody said to me, I don't know if it was my little brother or who it was, they said, at this point you've worked as a cowboy in North America and Australia, and at that point I had been to Argentina too. I guess I skipped over that, but he said, you're halfway there, so why not go for the other half? So that was really when it became a goal, but that was 2-3 years into it.
So, when you originally kind of made this plan to go about doing this, how did you figure out what countries you were visiting, when you were visiting them? How were you networking with all these people and kind of connecting with these people? Because I would assume that when you're going to different continents, you only know so many people abroad. I would imagine you had to kind of expand your network to kind of reach out to more people and kind of make this plan a reality.
That's right. So what I tried to do in each of the different places I went to is just find one person that I didn't necessarily have to know them, but had an opportunity for me, whether that be a job or just a place to stay or something like that. And once you have your foot in the door with just one person, it makes it a lot easier to make arrangements to travel down there or wherever you're going. And then from there, it's very easy to, or at least easy for me. I've never had a problem networking and finding people once I was in the country. And I was kind of just like a stray dog wandering around, and I'd jump in any pickup that had food and a place for me to sleep. And so that mentality is kind of reckless and very dangerous, I guess, because you just have to trust in strangers most of the time. But if you have I never had really a set itinerary. I never, my only restriction was money. And so as long as I had money to continue traveling, I would just go wherever there was something cool happening, or people were willing to let me work for them. Most of the time I worked for free. I just told people that if you feed me and give me a place to sleep, I'll come work for free. And then that way it wasn't costing me anything, and it was costing them fairly little. And I got a lot of experience out of it that way. So that was the biggest move I figured out. Like, if you're not going to get rich going and doing this, at least you're not going to have a pocket full of money, but you'll have a lot of experiences after having done stuff like that. So that's really where the value comes from.
Yeah, that sounds super dangerous. And if you're listening and thinking of doing this, be safe, be careful. I want to hear just like a little description of each place where you went, you don't have to say like names of who you worked for if you don't want, but what you did, if it was always ranching. I know you were in Mongolia, and you spent a lot of time with, horse cultures up there. So just like a little synopsis on each place and what you were doing when you were there, just scavenging food and sleeping in trucks.
Yeah. So it started with Australia, and I was working for a crew where we were contracted by the government to go out and catch feral cattle. So the bulls were really hard to bring in horseback, and they probably, a lot of those bulls would probably kill your horse if you rode up too close to them. So a lot of that was done with machines, but there was also a lot of just cows and calves and stuff out there that had no brands on them. So a lot of that work we did with helicopters and horses. We called it coaching them, and we'd start with a small bunch at the far side of the pasture right when the sun came up, and then we would just start driving them in the easiest path to the gate back to the corrals, and then we had helicopters working with us. So the helicopters would sweep through and kind of push the cattle, and as we came across the whole pasture, the herd would just grow and grow. So our job horseback was not to go out through the brush and find cattle. It was to keep the main bunch together and moving and as calm as possible. So I spent, that was the first place I went, and that was what I did pretty much the whole time. After that, I went to Argentina. Argentina was, I lived with gauchos on a couple different ranches, or they call them estancias, and they played some polo, but a lot of it was just being horseback, going out checking cows, moving cows. Labor in Argentina and a lot of countries is super cheap. So having a guy horseback, like a lot of those places had tons of, they might have had 20 employees on a normal ranch down there, and everybody was horseback at 4 a.m. going out and heat checking or moving cows around or pulling bulls or whatever we were doing. Fairly similar to here, ranching operations here. And so I worked on a handful of outfits down there doing that. After that would have been Sweden. I went to Sweden for 90 days because that's as long as a visa lasts in Europe for an American. Went over there and I worked for the biggest ranch in Sweden. They don't really exist over there because there's a cap on how much land you can privately own in Sweden. So because of that, it's not really possible to own a big ranch over there. So the family I worked for had a special situation where they leased out an entire military base from the Swedish military, and they would keep the grass short because it was a Panzer division or whatever they call it, tanks. So they use these big fields to do drills and practice with their tanks, and they didn't want the grass to be like hip high. So this family had a long-term lease on this huge place, and so it was pretty regular. We'd be out moving cows around. They were the only family that I knew of that moved cows or did anything like that horseback. Most.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I just had a quick question because I think people will find it interesting. Do you know what the cap is in Sweden for like the amount of land you're allowed to own?
I don't know the exact number. They told me that, and they actually pointed it out with the logging industry over there, because in the United States, logging companies own huge amounts of land because they buy it and just let it sit there and grow trees. But over there, those logging companies were constantly running up against that cap, whatever it was. And so they'd have to buy a piece of land, log it, replant it, and then sell it immediately so they could buy the chunk next to it and log through that. So that it was like a constant turnover of land. So most farms and ranches and stuff that you would see in Sweden were very small. There was more dairies than there were beef operations, and even the beef operations were kind of, they might have 15, 20 cows kind of in the backyard. They had to, the law down there stated that the cows in the wintertime, any cattle whatsoever, had to be inside of a barn. So just like dairy farms in the US where they have those big open stall barns, even beef cattle were required to be in those type of barns in the wintertime in Sweden. So it was it's hard to raise cattle down there. So this family that I worked for was really an exception just because of the laws and restrictions and government oversight on everything that they did. But I don't know the cap. I don't know the number for that. After Sweden, I went straight from Sweden down to South Africa. And I worked on a handful of different kind of ranch farm operations down there. Horses are less common in Africa, and it's not because they don't have them. It's because people are less willing to use them, and the reason they would rather walk than ride a lot of times, and the reason for that is because there's no infrastructure and there's no healthcare and there's no safety net to catch you. So a lot of these guys that were out working livestock and stuff preferred to walk because they knew friends who had gotten hurt on horses, or they themselves have. But say you fall off and break your leg, that you're not going to the hospital down there. And if your leg heals wrong or something happens where you're permanently crippled, that there's nobody there to take care of you. If you're lucky, you might have a child or something that can go out and make money, but most of these people are barely getting by as it is. So horses to them seemed like a bigger risk than reward, because it was there was still people that used them down there, that specifically guys that come out of this. There's a little landlocked country inside of South Africa called Lesotho, and Lesotho is way up high. It's high altitude. It's in the Drakensberg Mountains, and they're very poor, and there's not much going on up there other than raising livestock. So a lot of those guys would come down out of the mountains and work in South Africa, and those guys were the greatest horsemen that I saw in Africa. Their culture, because of the mountains and stuff, was much more based around horses than actual South African culture. So it was usually the migrant workers that were using them for the most part. And they rode in saddles that were like $200 saddles made of all nylon and fiberglass, and they were incredibly uncomfortable, and they just used them to kind of to get by because that's what they could afford. But their horse pads were usually like dog food sacks just stuffed full of wool stuff. So they made a lot of their own equipment, but the saddles themselves, they didn't really make those, and they were pretty awful quality, but they made them work. So that's Africa, and then after Africa, I went to Mexico, and I spent a couple months in Mexico working on that was more of a farm than it was a ranch. We still worked cattle and stuff, but a lot of that was like harvesting corn and things like that. And then we had the neighbors. I'd go help the neighbors, and they had like an intensive grazing operation where they would put up semi-permanent electric fence and lease land from the neighbors and move their cows around. So I got to ride with those folks a lot, just pushing their cows around and doctoring stuff out there wherever they needed it done. And then the last place that I went was Mongolia. And Mongolia is an extremely rich horse culture. The majority of that country, I think it's 60 or 70%, is still nomadic, which means they may own a car, but for the most part, they live out of tents and they just ride horses everywhere. And everybody down there can ride. It's crazy. It's like it's in their blood. And I worked for kind of a touristy type place for a little bit, and there was a taxi driver that was bringing some tourists from the airport out to where we were working, and he was driving in a little Toyota Prius down a 2-track road, and he saw one of these tourists was having a hard time controlling their horse. And this guy, as far as I knew, was a driver, and that was all he had ever done. And he got out of his taxi, got that person off their horse. He got on the horse, disappeared over the backside of a hill with the horse, came back 2-3 minutes later, and that horse was acting the way it should, and he put that person right back on the horse, and he got back in his taxi and drove off. So it's just that culture is just completely based around the horse, and they have been for thousands of years. So they were some of the most impressive horsemen that I ever saw. So yeah, that's kind of a very brief uh, idea of what I did.
1 in 4 people experience mental health issues each year. This spring, you can help support mental health awareness and support nonprofit organizations changing lives through horses by joining the 2nd annual Seen Through Horses campaign. Join us May 1st through 31st, 2023 during Mental Health Awareness Month for the Seen Through Horses campaign, and together we can make a much-needed difference for mental health globally. To learn more, visit horsesformentalhealth.org.
That's really fascinating, actually. You kind of already touched on this when you were talking about Africa and how these guys that you were working with were probably some of the best horsemen that you've been around, and just their lifestyle and everything kind of forced them to learn how to do these things. But can you kind of touch on how horsemanship kind of changes depending on the country or the continent that you're on, and what you've kind of taken away from each of these experiences to apply in your own horse life, your own ranch life, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it varies a lot, but it's all kind of the same idea that it's usually, in my experience, the tack was the kind of the biggest difference, was just the different ways they had figured out to do the same thing. The other thing that I noticed was varied a lot on culture was the use of leg pressure in any way. And so like you look at Argentinians and gauchos, and I had always thought that those guys were like super great horsemen, and not that they aren't, but they use 0 foot pressure. Like the gauchos, and they ride incredibly, like uncomfortably long stirrups, but that's just how they ride. And it's all just on the mouth. They just kind of haul their head around, and which was surprising to me because I'd always, now that's not true with like polo players and performance type horses in Argentina. They're, very on par with what we do here with polo horses. But as far as the gauchos, there was no foot pressure whatsoever. They did a lot of roping down there, but their saddles don't have a tree or any sort of structure to them. So when they roped stuff, they roped tied off to their latigos on the side of their saddle. They just had the rope tied right there. So it was usually tied right down by your right knee. And so that got a little bit hairy quite a few times just because but if you think about it, it's off center, but it's actually a lower center of gravity. So those horses a lot of times could hold the rope even better because it wasn't pulling on the top of them. So so Argentina was interesting, but fairly rough and rudimentary the way that they got by on horses. Australians there's not a lot of difference there other than the saddles that they use, but down there they do something called camp drafting, and that it's basically like reining cow horse type stuff down there. And so they use a lot of the same principles that you would see here in the US, and I think they get a lot of their information from American and Canadian trainers and stuff like that. So not a big difference down there. In Africa, that the way I don't know that those guys were like super great horsemen, because in the way we look at it, because that like their training was very different. Those horses, to them, those guys that owned those horses, that was probably the most expensive thing that they owned. And so they were really about teaching their horses tricks, and like had just incredible bonding with their horses. But at the end of the day, those horses were just from getting from point A to point B. So there was, I wouldn't say there was any like exceptional training used you're not going to like be cutting cows out of a bunch with African horses and stuff like that. You're not going to get that type of performance out of a horse, but also these guys can like have their horse lay down on command, and they lay there with their horse and like snuggle with them. So it was a very different kind of relationship, I guess, with the horse, where they weren't really working animals. They were like their best friends that they happened to take to work with them. So that's not a bad thing, but it was different from like a performance horse type of world thing. So then where else do we have? Sweden over there was, my view of that's a little bit skewed. I thought they were, just because the people I worked for were the only ones that used horses for that type of work. So they imported all of their tack and stuff from the United States and Canada. That entire family had worked in Australia, Canada, and the US on big ranches. So that was just like here, but that was specifically because of that family. Other horse people in Sweden, I wasn't around a lot of them, but everything else, all the other horses in that country were pets or kind of leisure animals where they maybe did some competitions, but it was like jumping, dressage, or just kind of pasture pets that people just went out and rode for fun. So the family I worked for there was an exception for sure. And then Mongolia, the horse culture down, Mexico, I skipped over Mexico. Mexico, same thing, very Americanized. They used American saddles and bits and everything else like that. Not a huge difference down there. I saw some really, really nice horses in Mexico, especially at the rodeos. I'd go to the rodeos, and they could slide like 30, 40 feet. They had some really well-trained horses, and I don't know who owned all of those, because I would say half the horses were just like dead broke ranch geldings that you could just go, get a job done on, and then the other half were these like really nice performance horses that were slicked up, and you could tell they really took care of them. But Mongolia was the wildest and most different. They, to my understand, from the way I understand it, is that Mongolian horses are not actually horses. They are, I forget what it is. They either have an extra set of chromosomes or they have one less set, same as donkeys. That's why mules are, you end up with infertile mules, is because there's a missing chromosome there. And these horses that they have down there, I was reading in a book, are actually closer related to donkeys than they are like a thoroughbred. So these horses acted different. They're small. They're dirty, rotten, tough. I mean, they can withstand anything. And but most of them had kind of tiger striped. Most of them were duns, but they had kind of different mannerisms than a normal horse. So the way those people train down there, a lot of those colts get broke as yearlings or 2-year-olds by little kids. And so it was pretty common to see a little kid, like a 8-year-old kid, riding a yearling around down there. And so they started, as soon as they were able to carry a kid, they started riding them down there. And they rode with very, very short stirrups, like almost like a jockey. And they stand way up out of their saddle. And saddles are also really uncomfortable because they're kind of like a V shape that you sit down in. So when you sit, your knees are way up, by your hands where your reins are. And so those guys had rode their whole life. As soon as you're going any faster than a walk, they're standing up in the stirrups way up above the horse. And I think a lot of that came from they were hunting or fighting in wars, riding that way. And then also they don't use like a rope like we would here to catch wild horses. They have a big long stick. I forget what they call it, but it has a loop on the end. And that's how they would catch stuff. And you have to be kind of standing to do that. So totally different way of riding down there. But those guys at a dead run could just bend down and pick stuff up off the ground. It was kind of a sport that they played down there, and another kind of cool fact about Mongolian horses, their halters, they had rope halters on everything, and the piece that went down like under the horse's chin, that was actually a curb bit or not a curb bit, like a snaffle bit that went right up underneath the horse's chin, and it stayed there all the time, and it was bent so that it didn't dig into their bones on the bottom of their jaw. And where that came from is apparently 1,000 years ago, or however long it was, when Genghis Khan was running Mongolia, he had a rule that every man in the country had to be ready to go to war within like 3 or 5 minutes of getting word. So they stopped using bridles altogether, and so they just started putting those snaffle bits on the bottom of the halters. So all you have to do is loosen the knot, pop it in their mouth, tighten it back up, and then the lead rope, you just tie it around the other side and hop on, and you're ready to go to war. So they still do that nowadays.
That's a neat little history lesson. I think, are you talking about the Chevalsky horses? It's spelled with like a P, starts with a P. That I think those were in Mongolia. That's such a super interesting thing. I'm putting you on the spot here, but can you think of like one specific lesson you learned from some of the horsemen you were around that really stuck with you about horses? Anything that you were like, wow, that's a new way to look at things, or I really like that training method, or just something that you really liked? Just one thing.
Yeah. So when I was in Australia, I don't claim to be a great horseman. I'm not a horse trainer. So I was just learning the whole time with these different people. And in Australia was the first time they gave me a colt when I first got there that had, I don't know if he'd ever been ridden, and if he had, it was probably 1 or 2 times, and then he was turned back out and had pretty much reverted to being wild. So the first day I got on that colt, he tried to buck. He never did buck me off, other than one time we were at a dead run. He didn't even buck me off. He just spooked out from underneath me, and I had to get flown out in the helicopter because of that. But other than that, he tried to buck me off a lot, and I hadn't been on a lot of real young horses like that. And my boss down there was an excellent horseman, and so he was always giving me little pointers and cues on what I should be doing with this horse, and we learned together. I mean, we progressed together a lot, which was pretty cool. And one thing that I'll never forget that guy told me, that colt was really hard to catch and really hard to saddle. So we'd be up in the dark trying to be ready to go by 5 a.m. and everybody else is saddled, and I'm still trying to catch this colt in a big old pen. And so I worked on it a lot. And my boss told me, he said, this goes for cattle and horses or any type of livestock. He said you should always leave animals the way that you want to find them. So that colt, I would always have him facing me when I turned him out. And I would never, if he was jittery and wanting to take off with his friends or anything, I would not turn him loose until he was standing there calm, just facing me. And I would like rub him down and do all this stuff, and just to kind of get him gentle. And the more I did that, the easier he became to catch. And it got to the point where after 2 or 3 weeks that I would have my horse caught and saddled before everybody else, because he'd be standing there at the gate waiting for me. And so I don't know if that's completely true, but for me, it dang sure worked. That I started, it's pretty easy at the end of the day to just like take that halter off and throw it on the ground and just let your horse go, because you're tired, they're tired. And that's what I was doing at first, and just changing that, putting in that little bit of effort. And I mean, it went further than just catching him as well. I mean, we became a lot more connected, and we worked on mentally. We worked on a lot more stuff, and that was super helpful.
I think some people could probably take that advice and apply it to their horse life in general. I think that's a great piece of advice, and it sounds like it helped you a lot. So, through your journeys, you decided to come up with a book. How did that kind of start? What was the inspiration behind that? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, the I never intended to write a book. Kind of towards the end of my travels, people made comments like, "Oh, this could be a book" or something like that when I would tell them stories of things that I had done, and um, so it kind of planted a seed in my mind that I could write a book, but I didn't think I was capable of that, and so I thought I would probably just get a ghostwriter or something like that to write the book for me. And when I was in Mexico, I ended up uh, getting stuck in, I wouldn't say in the middle, but being way too close to a big gunfight that went down. Um, and so I was in the house I was staying in, and I was staying with my boss's grandparents, and his mom's like 70 or 75 years old, and she was just terrified, and she was telling me to lay on the floor uh, below the window so I didn't catch a stray bullet, and there's just gunfire going off in the streets all around me, and I was laying there for 20 or 30 minutes while this all happened, and I was thinking, it's entirely possible that I could die doing any of this stuff that I go out and do for fun. So I don't, if that's going to happen, I don't want to take all these stories to the grave with me. And so that got me writing. I started writing more, journaling more, stuff like that. And so when I went back after that, it was a few months later, and I was night calving for my grandpa, and so I was just had 12 hours a day in the dark by myself, pretty much doing nothing. And so what I started to do was just tell the stories to my laptop, kind of like audio record them. And I started doing that, and I got to thinking about it, and there had been some articles written about this stuff, and I was thinking that if I let somebody else write the book for me, and it comes out and I don't like it or it doesn't do any good, um, I would probably not be able to live with myself knowing that I was capable of writing the book and didn't, and just took the easy way out of having somebody else write it for me. And I think that's different. Like if you're a super busy person and you don't have the time to write a book and you hire a ghostwriter, that's one thing. But just hiring a ghostwriter for the sake of getting out of doing it yourself, um, at least for me, I couldn't live with that, knowing that if it didn't do well or I wasn't happy with the finished product, there's no going back and fixing that. So it was about that time that I stopped doing the audio recordings, and I just kind of made an outline of all the stories that I wanted to tell, and I started typing them. And I typed 1,000 words a day for the whole calving season, and which seems like a lot, but that's like an hour ish or a little bit less, and to write that much. And so I just started typing them out one a day, and calving season's only 3 months long, 90 days. So I didn't get the book done in 1 year. I got it done. It was spread out over at least 2 calving seasons, maybe 3, because then I would shelf it when I was done. I never could find the time to write after calving season. So I'd shelf it for 9 months and not look at it, not think about it, come back to it the following calving season and get a bunch more of it done. And then the editing process was the same. Once I felt like I had a finished manuscript, I just edited 1,000 words a day throughout the calving season. Then I used a couple different types of software to go through and catch all the easy mistakes. And then I used some friends of mine who are way smarter than I am to go through and read the last couple versions to catch the mistakes that the computer didn't. And there's still a handful of mistakes even in the printed books now that people have been finding, but it was all done ranching. A lot of it was either done in a calving barn or in a pickup with wet, soggy calves at my feet.
That's really cool. So before we let you go, can you kind of let people know what's next from here? Are you going to be going, international again and working on different ranches? Are you sticking around here in the States for a bit? What's on your 2023 plan?
So 2023, I don't have any big international plans. I have ideas of where I would like to go next, but this summer is pretty much dedicated to the book tour stuff and just trying to get my book out there and push it. I'm not sure when this podcast will be out, but May 19th through 21st, I'll be in the Jackson Hole, Wyoming area doing a couple different signings there. I've already done a couple down in Texas, and they went far better than I ever could have imagined. And then this summer, I'll be traveling all over Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, doing different book signing events, trying to kind of coordinate with other events that might be happening around Wyoming. And they kind of go together, and it's worked well marketing wise, where I shoot music videos also for cowboy musicians. So all the book signings that I've done, and I plan for all the ones going forward, they also have live music kind of coupled together. So it's a show and a book signing, and I get together with some of the artists that I've worked with in the past, and we do it's bigger than just me sitting at a table signing books. It's a whole show. So this summer, that's what I'll be doing. I'll be shooting music videos, helping my grandpa on the ranch, and every single weekend all summer for the next 3 months, I'll be at different events, trying to push the book and get it out there.
Well, it sounds like you have a really busy year planned, but full of really exciting things. Before we let you go, where can people follow along, whether they want to come to one of your book signings or your tour, or just see what cool adventures you're up to?
Yeah, Instagram is pretty much where all my stuff goes. My Instagram's The Lost Cowboy. That's also the title of the book, The Lost Cowboy. The music stuff, if people are interested in seeing the kind of cowboy musicians, that's called Dusty Vaquero. But both of those, Instagram, Facebook, thelostcowboy.com, you can find my book on there and other information like that. But if you want to see day-to-day stuff, it's usually on Instagram, on the Lost Cowboy Instagram.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I know I really enjoyed hearing about your international travels and just what riding and horse culture is like in the different continents and countries that you got to visit, because, we're so stuck in what we are in the United States. It's hard to branch out, and it's really cool to hear from someone who's had first person experience doing some of these really fun things. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Glad we could finally get together on this.
Once again, we'd like to thank the Seen Through Horses campaign for sponsoring this episode of The Ride. Thank you guys for tuning into The Ride podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow Horse and Rider Magazine on social media and find us at horseandrider.com to see all the cool things that we're up to. And if you have any comments or questions, please be sure to hit us up at horseandrider@equinenetwork.com. We want to hear from you guys. And if you like what you're listening to, please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes.